Trevor here. Today, I'm exploring and illustrating Taphophobia, the excessive and irrational fear of being buried alive. I will be illustrating imagery that could be triggering for people with this phobia. If that's not for you, then scroll down and have a nice chat in the comments while you listen in. The word taphophobia comes from the Greek words taphos, meaning grave or tomb, and phobos, meaning fear. People with this specific phobia can be consumed with unsettling thoughts of being prematurely pronounced dead and buried alive, only to awaken to a perilous destiny, constrained, blind, and 6 feet under unyielding, cold, wet earth. This scenario is undoubtedly scary to anyone, no matter how unlikely it is to occur. But I was surprised to find that these live burials could have been unnervingly more commonplace than we would like to believe. This is probably what led to taphophobia being so common. With modern medical advances and an increasing knowledge about the process of death, our physicians have standards and procedures to follow that ensure people are not inaccurately pronounced dead and subsequently subject to the terrible fate of being buried alive. But the stories and legends of live burials of the past live on to meet people at just the right moment in their life to instill taphophobia. In 1896, the London Association for the Prevention of Premature Burial was founded in reaction to the lack of a commonplace final check by medically competent persons to ensure a body was in fact a body and not, say, someone in a coma or some form of suspended animation. This foundation also advocated for the use of safety coffins, wherein the coffin had a bell assembly attached to it that the buried could use to ring in hopes of notifying passerbys or grave tenders so they could be exhumed. There are also accounts of historical figures with taphophobia. Notably, Frederick Chopin, who had requested his heart be cut out to ensure his death, and George Washington, who requested his body be laid out for 3 days before being buried. Other requests of this nature included having their main arteries cut open, rendering resurrection impossible. The claims of a high rate of live burials in the past are often contested, some saying that the natural decomposition of a body could have caused some of the signs previously taken to mean someone was struggling against the interior of their coffin. Marks thought to be made by fingernails carving casket lids nailed closed could have just been made by the process of which we are all returned to the earth. These detractors would attribute the pervasiveness of this phobia to over-sensationalization by newspapers over the fear of live burials during the cholera epidemics of the 1800s, as well as popular literature works highlighting the subject, such as Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Premature Burial. With someone like Poe writing about it, it's no small stretch of the imagination to think he could have imparted some people with taphophobia. Here's an excerpt. It may be asserted without hesitation that no event is so terribly well adapted to inspire the supremeness of bodily and mental distress as is burial before death. The unendurable oppression of the lungs, the stifling fumes from the damp earth, the clinging to death garments, the rigid embrace of the narrow house, the blackness of the absolute night, the silence like a sea that overwhelms, the unseen but palpable presence of the conqueror worm. These things, with the thoughts of air and grass above, with memory of dear friends who would fly to save us if but informed of our fate, and with consciousness that of this fate they can never be informed, that our hopeless portion is that of the really dead. These considerations, I say, carry into the heart, which still palpitates, a degree of appalling and intolerable horror from which the most daring imagination must recoil. We know nothing so agonizing upon earth. The narrator in Poe's tale then tells stories to convey his own debilitating taphophobia, because as it turns out, he's prone to prolonged states of unconsciousness, leaving him vulnerable to being mistaken dead and buried alive. One such story follows. an officer of artillery, a man of gigantic stature and of robust health, being thrown from an unmanageable horse, received a very severe contusion upon the head, which rendered him insensible at once. The skull was slightly fractured, but no immediate danger was apprehended. Trepanning was accomplished successfully. He was bled, and many other ordinary means of relief were adopted. Gradually, however, he fell into a more and more hopeless state of stupor, and finally it was thought that he died. The weather was warm, and he was buried with indecent haste in one of the public cemeteries. His funeral took place on Thursday. On the Sunday following, the grounds of the cemetery were, as usual, much thronged with visitors. And at about noon, an intense excitement was created by the declaration of a peasant that, while sitting upon the grave of the officer, he had distinctly felt a commotion of the earth, as if occasioned by someone struggling beneath. At first, little attention was paid to the man's asseveration, but his evident terror and the dogged obstinacy with which he persisted in his story had at length their natural effect upon the crowd. Spades were hurriedly procured, and the grave, which was shamefully shallow, was in a few minutes so far thrown open that the head of its occupant appeared. He was then seemingly dead, but he sat nearly erect within his coffin, the lid of which, in his furious struggles, had partially uplifted. He was forthwith conveyed to the nearest hospital, and there pronounced to be still living, although in an asphytic condition. After some hours he revived, recognized individuals of his acquaintance, and, in broken sentences, spoke of the agonies in the grave. From what he related, it was clear that he must have been conscious of life for more than an hour while inhumed, before lapsing into insensibility. The grave was carelessly and loosely filled with exceedingly porous soil, and thus some air was necessarily admitted. He heard the footsteps of the crowd overhead and endeavored to make himself heard in turn. It was the tumult within the grounds of the cemetery, he said, which appeared to awaken him from a deep sleep. But no sooner was he awake than he became fully aware of the awful horrors of his position. Even if the numbers are exaggerated due to the pandemonium of the past, it is easy to see how someone could be gripped with terror of being buried alive, even when they know it statistically won't happen to them. The effects of taphophobia can have on someone could be significant, leading them to avoid important and meaningful events such as funerals or visiting the resting place of a loved one. Symptoms when confronted with triggering events are panic attacks, avoiding tight spaces, breathlessness, migraines, an impending sense of dread, and other symptoms commonly associated with panic disorders. Well, that was enough of exploring the fear of being buried alive for me. I hope you've enjoyed my illustration, and if you have any ideas or maybe a short story that you would like to see illustrated, let me know in the comments below. You can find me streaming on Twitch and posting more art to my Instagram and Twitter. Links are below. Thanks for hitting that like and subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.